My name is Dorothea Vaillancourt. I am 79 years old, and I was the postmistress of Corbeil Fawkes, Ontario, for 31 years, from 1967 until I retired in the spring of 1998. In that capacity, I handled every piece of correspondence that came in and out of that community, and I can tell you with professional certainty that the people of Corbeil Fawkes were not a people who talked about things they did not need to talk about. That restraint is why I am still alive to speak of Madeleine Auger at all. That restraint is the reason the thing I'm about to tell you was never told to anyone outside the valley for more than 50 years. Madeleine's daughter asked me to make this recording last October, when she came up from Sudbury to close Madeleine's house. She sat in my kitchen, Sylvie did, with her hands flat on my table the way her mother used to do when she was composing herself. And she said to me, "Dorothea, if you do not put it down somewhere, it goes with you, and then it is nowhere." And she was right. I am 79. My husband Claude passed in 2019. There is no one left in Corbeil Fawkes who was there at the beginning. No one who knew what Madeleine brought home from the Nashcorrie River country in September of 1961, and no one who watched what she did with it for the next 22 years. Except me. I watched all of it. I was her closest neighbour and, I think, her closest friend, though Madeleine was a woman who held the word friend at arm's length, the way some people hold hot things. So I am speaking into this recorder, which Sylvie left on my kitchen table, with a little note that said simply, "Whenever you are ready." I do not know that I am ready. I know that I am the last one, and that counts for more than readiness. Madeleine Auger was 34 years old in the autumn of 1961, and she had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Fernand Auger, was a contract surveyor who worked for a timber company out of North Bay, and he died of a cardiac event in the field in July of 1960, alone on a hillside above the Nashcorrie River, 63 kilometres northeast of the nearest road. A colleague found him the following morning and they brought him out by float plane. He was 41. They had been married 6 years and had no children, and the absence of children was, I understood much later, not a choice, but a wound Madeleine had been carrying since her first year of marriage. She did not speak of it. What Madeleine did not speak of, she did not speak of, and the rest of us understood that. She lived in a low house at the end of a dirt road that was technically in the municipality of Corbeil Fawkes, but sat 3 kilometres from the nearest other dwelling, which was mine. She had a kitchen garden, 2 goat pens, and a wood stove she could coax into producing extraordinary heat. After Fernand died, she took in sewing, altered clothing for women in town, repaired church vestments when they were sent to her, and survived the first winter without her husband by working from before dawn until after dark, in a way that looked, from the outside, like industry, and was, I suspect, mostly refusal. She refused to move. She refused to go to her sister in Sturgeon Falls. She refused the casseroles that people brought for the first month, and then, politely, and with evident relief on their own parts, stopped bringing. She was a private woman, and Corbeil Fawkes was a community that respected privacy the way you respect a fence line, which is to say, you noted it, you did not cross it, and you did not ask whose fence it was, or why it was there. I was 32 that autumn, a year married to Claude, who worked at the mill in town. We had Sylvie's friendship with Madeleine to thank for my friendship with her, because when children are close, their mothers are drawn together, whether they plan to be or not. But that friendship was still 3 years away in 1961. In the autumn of 1961, I was her nearest neighbour, and I brought her firewood when Claude had extra, and she thanked me without warmth and offered me tea she did not expect me to accept. That was the extent of it. In the first week of September 1961, Madeleine did something that no one in Corbeil Fawkes could explain, and that I only came to understand completely some years later. She drove her husband's truck northeast along the logging roads until the roads ended, and she walked another 11 kilometers into the Nashkuri River country. She did not tell anyone she was going. She was gone for 4 days, and when she came back with her face changed in a way I did not have language for at the time, and would now describe as a woman who has made a decision so large it has rearranged the architecture of her face. She also came back with something wrapped in her canvas field jacket, carried against her chest with both arms, the way you carry a newborn. I know this because I was the first person she encountered when she came down off the logging road, and I happened to be in my yard splitting kindling. She walked past the end of my property without stopping, and she looked at me once, steadily, and I understood from that look that I was to ask nothing. So I asked nothing. I watched her go up the path to her house and push through the door and close it behind her, and I went back to splitting kindling, and I thought about what I had seen for the rest of that day and for many days after. I did not know what she was carrying. I knew only that it was alive because the jacket moved with a breathing that was not hers. It was 4 weeks before I saw it, and even then, I saw it only because a thing happened that Madeleine had not planned for. Her older goat, a grey and white animal she called Mart, had developed a problem with her left rear hoof that needed attention, and Madeleine came to my door in late September to ask if Claude might look at it, because Claude had kept goats before we married and knew the work. Claude was in town. I said I would come myself and see what could be done. She hesitated in the doorway. She did not refuse me, and she did not easily invite me in, and for a long moment she simply stood with her hand on the frame. Then she stepped back, and I came through. The interior of Madeleine Auger's kitchen was warm in the particular way of a house that has been heated beyond what a single person requires. The stove was running high, and there was a smell I could not immediately place. Something animal and close but not unpleasant, like the smell of a summer barn in good weather. There was a door at the back of the kitchen, the door to the small room Fernand had used as a storage room for his survey equipment, and that door was closed. I saw that the latch had been replaced recently. The new wood around the latch was pale where the old door frame was dark. Madeleine took me out the back to the goat pen without going through that room, and while I worked on Martha's hoof, crouching in the cold mud and pressing the animal steady with my shoulder, I heard a sound from inside the house. It was low. It was repetitive in the way that breathing is repetitive, but it was not breathing. It was something between a sound and a silence, a vocalization so deep it registered more in my chest than in my ears, and it lasted perhaps 30 seconds and then stopped. I did not look up from the hoof. I said nothing. Madeleine, who had crouched beside me to pass the small knife when I needed it, did not move and did not speak. That was the first time I heard it. I would hear it many more times over the following years. I would come to know its variations the way you come to know the voices of your own household, to understand what each variation meant, though understanding in that case is perhaps too deliberate a word. You learned it the way you learn any large weather, by long exposure and a willingness to be still. I understood that autumn that Madeleine Auger was keeping something in the storage room. I understood, from the jacket and the smell and the particular quality of her face when she talked about the goats and looked at the house, that whatever she was keeping was not an ordinary animal. I did not understand yet that it was young, that it was wounded, that she had found it beside the Nashkuri River, in a situation I have thought about for more than 60 years, and still cannot reconstruct completely from what she told me, which was not much, and came slowly, over many years, in the piecemeal way that someone who is not certain they should be speaking allows themselves to speak. What she told me, eventually and in pieces, was this. In her first weeks of widowhood, she had taken to walking the logging roads alone in the evenings, past the safe distances, further than a woman alone had reason to go, not looking for anything, or looking for something that could not be named, which is the same as not looking. She had done this from August of 1960 until the summer of 1961. And on those walks she had accumulated a familiarity with the country north of Corbeil Forks that she put to use in September, when she packed 4 days of food into Fernand's canvas pack and drove to the end of the road and walked east into the Nashkuri country, following the route of Fernand's last survey because she wanted to see the hillside where he had died. She found the hillside. She sat on it for a long time. She had her grief, and then she sat longer and had more of it, and then she began to walk back, and it was on the walk back, following the river south toward the logging road, that she came around a stand of white spruce and found the young one sitting in the cold shallows of the river with its left arm extended and its eyes fixed on the far bank. Madeleine said she stopped walking when she saw it, and it did not turn toward her, and it did not leave the water. She said she stood still for a long time, perhaps 5 minutes, and watched it, and that it was only when it moved to lift itself out of the water that she understood the left arm was not right, that the way it moved the arm was the way nothing moves, a thing that works properly. It gained the bank with difficulty and sat down on the gravel with a sound she described as the sound of something very tired, setting down, something very heavy, and it looked at her. She said the look was not surprise, and it was not threat, and it was not a request for anything she could name. She said it looked at her the way a thing looks at something it has been waiting to encounter without knowing that it was waiting. Then it stopped looking at her and looked at the arm. She had, in her pack, the first aid kit she always carried when walking in that country, because Fernand had insisted on it. She did not think about what she was doing. She crossed the gravel bar. She sat down 4 feet from the young one and opened the kit. The arm was injured at the shoulder, not broken but badly wrenched, displaced in a way she could not fully assess without more knowledge than she had. She had a tensor bandage, a short splint intended for a human forearm, antiseptic. She used what she had. The young one was still through all of it, absolutely still in the way that very large things go still when they have decided to endure something, and Madeleine worked steadily and without speaking, and when she was finished she sat back on her heels, and the young one did not move, and she did not move, and they remained that way until the light began to change. She could not leave it there. That was the decision that rearranged her face. She knew she could not leave it there, and she knew what that meant. And she made it in the gravel by the Nashkuri River in the last daylight of a September afternoon, with what I can only describe as the absolute quiet of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be required of them. It took 2 days to come back down to the truck. The young one moved slowly, and Madeleine matched her pace to its, and on the second night they slept at the same fire, which I think neither of them planned. She would tell me this part only once, years later, briefly and without elaboration, that she had fed it from her pack, and it had accepted what she offered, and that in the morning it was still there. She wrapped it in Fernand's jacket when the logging road came in sight. Not to hide it from herself. To keep it calm, she thought, though she told me she was not sure, even then, which of them the jacket was truly for. He was small for what he was, she said, small and young and alone, and it was getting cold. Those were the words she used. She said them once, that first winter when she had begun to trust me and I had begun to ask, and then she did not say them again because she did not need to. I will call him what Madeleine called him, which was the name she chose in the second week, when he had come out of the storage room for the first time and stood in her kitchen, with his head below the ceiling by only a hand's width, and regarded her pots and pans with the serious attention he gave to everything new. She called him Grand, which was not a diminutive, and was not irony. He was already, at what she believed was a young age, 4 feet taller than she was, and she said she could think of no name more honest. Grand recovered through that winter. The shoulder healed as much as it was going to, which was not entirely, and he carried the arm a little lower than the right for the rest of the time I knew him, a small compensation in his posture that I found, after a while, as familiar as any other feature of his presence. The healing took until February, by Madeleine's account. She had driven to the library in North Bay in November and returned with 2 books on animal rehabilitation that she read carefully at the kitchen table in the evenings after he had settled, making notes on the backs of envelopes, and she applied what she learned with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to working within the limits of what is available. She made a compress from old wool blankets. She adjusted the splinting material twice when the arm changed in the way that healing things change. She sat with him in the early dark of those northern winter evenings, and she was not lonely, which was the first time since Fernand's death that she had been somewhere other than lonely. And I think she knew it, and was grateful to him for it even then. Madeleine rebuilt the storage room to accommodate him, enlarging the doorway and reinforcing the floor, and she arranged her house around him the way you arrange a house around any permanent presence, moving furniture, adjusting routines, acquiring things that were needed, and having no more of them than were needed. She brought in more firewood than a single woman required. She laid extra canvas on the floor of the storage room for warmth. She sourced quantities of dried fish and venison from the trappers she knew, telling them only that she was laying in provisions, and no one asked more than that, because it was not the custom to ask more than that. She was a practical woman. She was also, I came to understand, a woman who was for the first time in her adult life doing something large enough to require her whole attention. And that requirement was, I believe, what kept her alive through the second winter of her widowhood, and the third. My friendship with Madeleine grew slowly in the way of things that grow in cold climates, putting down roots before they show above ground. By the winter of 1963, I was her confidant, and Grand had been introduced to me properly in a moment that was, on Madeleine's part, carefully arranged, and, on my part, was the most profound thing I had witnessed in my life to that point. He came through the enlarged doorway into the kitchen and stood in the full lamplight and looked at me, and I looked back at him, and Madeleine sat at the table with her tea and watched us both, and nothing dramatic happened. He was enormous. His face was broad and still and very old-looking in the way that certain things are old from the beginning, old in their structure rather than their age, and his eyes were dark and full of a particular quality of attention that I can only describe as patient. He observed me the way someone observes a thing they need to form an accurate opinion of. Then he sat down on the floor because it was the only place that could hold him comfortably, and he looked at Madeleine. She nodded once, and he looked at me again. And that was the introduction. Over the following years, I learned what Madeleine had learned, which is that Grand communicated entirely through posture and gesture, and a deep vocalization that she could read and I could approximate. I learned that he was calm in all but a few situations, and that the situations that disturbed him were specific and not irrational, among them loud metal sounds at close range, the smell of certain solvents, and the sound of a floatplane engine, which would send him to the back of the house immediately, and which I always thought was connected to how Fernand's body had been brought out. Whether that connection was real, I cannot say. Madeleine believed it was real. She had stopped using the propane lantern before I met Grand, and had gone back to kerosene, and she did not explain why until the third winter. And when she explained it, she did so in one sentence, telling me only that he prefers the older light. That was how she talked about him. That was all she needed to say. Sylvie was born in 1964, which meant that from the age of 3 or 4 she had known Grand the way children know the fixed things of their households as simply present and unremarkable. I have thought about this for many years, the particular gift of a child's acceptance, which is not incurious but is also not frightened, and which asks the questions that matter without the weight of the questions that do not. Sylvie asked me once, when she was perhaps 6, whether Grand was lonely. She did not ask what he was or where he had come from or why he lived with her mother. She asked if he was lonely. I said I did not know. She said she thought sometimes. And then she went back to whatever she had been doing, and I thought about that for a long time. Sylvie understood early that the house at the end of the road was not to be described to other children at school. She understood this not because she had been formally instructed, but because children who grow up alongside a secret absorb the grammar of it before they can name the thing itself. She did not lie exactly. She simply did not offer what was not asked for, and because no one asked the right questions were never put to her. She told me once, when she was grown, that she had spent years believing every family had something in their house that was not discussed, some arrangement between the ordinary world and something larger that the ordinary world could not accommodate, and that the discovery that most families did not have this was one of the small griefs of her adult life. She did not say this with self-pity. She said it the way her mother said difficult things, which was plainly with her hands flat, as a matter of established record. Madeline thought about it too. She had begun in the early years to put food at the edge of the tree line, past the garden in the hours before dawn, and the food disappeared. She did not tell me this until the 3rd or 4th year, and when she did, she described it with the same plain specificity she brought to everything, without sentiment or speculation. She put food at the tree line, and the food was taken, and in the mornings after it was taken, Grand was different, a little calmer, a little more settled in himself, in a way she could not quantify but could feel clearly. Whether there were others, and whether Grand knew them, and what passed between them in those hours, was something Madeline did not speculate about. I do not know either. I know the food was taken. I know Grand went to the back of the house in the early mornings and lay down at the door to the outside, which he could not fit through but which he could put his face near, and that he lay there until the light changed. Loving things that belong also to another world requires a particular kind of discipline. I saw that discipline in Madeleine every day I knew her. It was not sacrifice, which implies loss, and it was not indifference, which implies a withholding. It was a kind of attentiveness that had cleared itself of expectation, the way very still water clears itself of everything but what is at the bottom. She took care of what needed taking care of. She did not try to make Grand into something he was not, and she did not mourn what he was not. When he was troubled, she sat with him. When he was content, she went about her work. When he lay at the back door in the early mornings, she let him lie there, and she did not watch from the window, and she did not follow him with her eyes when he finally rose and came back into the warmth of the kitchen. People in Corbeil-Fawkes did not talk about Madeleine's house. This is the thing that always seems surprising to those outside a small community, the apparent improbability of collective silence, but it was not mysterious to me. Corbeil-Fawkes was a community of people who had each, at some point, needed something to not be spoken of, and the economy of that silence was as understood and as honoured as any other communal agreement. Therese Provost, who delivered milk and who was the first person outside our immediate circle to know because she came up the road one morning and saw Grand at the back door before Madeleine could redirect her, said nothing for as long as she lived, which was until 1991, and the only acknowledgement she ever made of what she knew was that she began leaving a second can of milk at the gate every Tuesday without being asked, and Madeleine paid her for 2 cans each Tuesday without comment. Hector Gagnon, who was then the mayor and who came to assess the road damage after the spring floods of 1969, and who pulled into Madeleine's property by mistake, and sat in his truck for a moment looking at the evidence of the enlarged doorway and the particular size of the footprints in the soft ground of the yard, turned his truck around and drove away. And he never spoke of it either. And when the road assessment came back, he had included Madeleine's access road in the repair list, which was not a requirement and which she had not requested. And she thanked him in writing on a card that said only that she appreciated his consideration. He knew what she meant. He always left his card in her post office box after that, every Christmas until he moved away to Sault Ste. Marie in 1977. His wife Denise, who I believe knew nothing definite but suspected something, always included a small packet of the dried cranberries she put up each fall, and the packet arrived every year without comment, and Madeleine kept every one of them in a tin on the shelf above the stove. I do not offer these people as proof of anything. I offer them because they were real, and their silence was real, and the way each of them found their own form of assent, their own small gesture of participation in what Madeleine was doing, seemed to me then, and seems to me now, the most honest expression of what a community can be at its best, which is a collection of people who understand that some lives cannot be lived within the boundaries of what can be officially acknowledged, and who make room for those lives anyway. Grand was with Madeleine for 22 years. He grew across those years in the way I can only describe as geological, slowly and completely, until by the time Sylvie was in high school, he had to turn sideways to pass through the enlarged doorway Madeleine had made for him, and the ceiling of the storage room, which she had raised twice, was barely adequate. He was, by Madeleine's estimate, nearly 9 feet tall, though measuring him precisely was not something that could be easily accomplished. He was broad through the chest, in a way that made the room feel differently proportioned when he was in it, and his hands, which I had seen gently remove a splinter from Sylvie's palm when she was 8 years old, with a delicacy that made me unable to speak for a minute after, were the size of splitting mauls. He moved quietly for something of his size, the careful movement of something that has learned its own dimensions in a space built for smaller things. Madeleine aged across those 22 years as everyone does, but she aged differently than she might have. There was a quality in her that I can only call sustained. She was not unchanged. She was thinner by her late 50s, and the winter of 1974 had taken something from her joints that never came back, and she wore her grey hair shorter as she got older because it was practical. But she had a quality of central stability that some people carry and most do not, and I attributed it, rightly or wrongly, to the discipline that caring for Grand had required of her. The clearing of expectation, the learning of attention. The signs began in the autumn of 1982, and if Madeleine had been a different kind of woman, she might not have read them as signs, because they were subtle and could have been otherwise explained. Grand began spending more time at the back door in the early mornings, not just the hours before dawn, but sometimes until midday, lying with his face near the seam of light at the threshold in a way that Madeleine had not seen before. He ate less, and not because he was ill. She checked carefully and found nothing wrong with him in any way she could assess. His attention, which had always been attentive to her and to the household, turned outward more consistently now, turned toward the tree line and the north, and she said there was a quality to that attention that was different from before. less the attention of someone watching, and more the attention of someone listening. She told me this the following spring, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface. She was 55 years old, and she looked it, in the good sense of that phrase, in the sense that 55 years had made her exactly what 55 years of that particular life would make a woman. She said she thought it was time, Dorothea. And she said it the way you say something you have known for longer than you have been willing to say it. I asked her what she meant, though I understood. She said he had been here long enough. Something is calling him, and I will not make him answer it from the wrong side of a door. She had thought about how to do it for some time, she told me. She was not going to simply open the back door and step aside, though that was perhaps what he needed. She wanted to take him back to the Nashkuri River country, to the river where she had found him. Whether this made any practical sense, whether the distance had any meaning to him, whether he would know the smell of that particular water after 22 years, she did not know and said so. But she said she had found him there, and she wanted to return him there. And the wanting was enough for her. I drove her to the end of the logging road in the last week of August 1983. She sat in the cab of the truck with Grand in the bed behind her, covered with the same canvas tarp she had used for years when she needed to transport him for any reason, and she was very quiet for the 3 hours of the drive, which I understood and honoured. When we reached the end of the road, she got out and came around and lowered the tailgate and spoke to him quietly, and he uncurled himself from the bed of the truck with the careful dignity he brought to all constrained spaces. And he stood in the morning light on the logging road and looked at the trees, and then he looked at Madeleine. She put her hand against his forearm, flat, the way she did when she wanted to communicate steadiness. He looked at her hand and then at her face. He made the low sound she had taught me over the years to associate with acknowledgement, a sound with patience in it, a sound that understood something completely. She said, "Go on then." He went. He did not look back, and she did not ask him to. He went into the trees, and within a few steps the trees had taken him, and within a minute there was no sound from the direction he had gone, and the morning settled back into ordinary morning sounds, the August insects and the distant run of water, and the cooling of the truck engine. Madeleine stood at the edge of the trees for a long time. I stood beside the truck and did not speak. Her old dog, a red heeler named Clue, who was by then 11 years old and moved slowly, sat in the dust of the road and watched the tree line with an expression that was not sorrow and not indifference, but something between them, the expression of an animal that understands endings without requiring them to be explained. We drove back to Corbeil Forks. Madeleine did not cry, and I did not expect her to. She had processed this grief before she arrived at it, in the way of her particular discipline. She looked out the window at the passing bush, and once, somewhere around the 2-hour mark, she said, "He was good company." And then she did not say anything else for the rest of the drive. And I did not offer anything, because there was nothing to offer that would have been adequate or that she would have wanted. She lived another 18 years after that August morning, and I was present for most of them. She sewed and kept goats and tended her kitchen garden, and became, in the way of older women in small communities who have earned a particular status, the person people came to when they did not know who else to come to. She had a quality of settled authority that was not loudness and was not coldness and was not the authority of someone who wants to be deferred to, but the authority of someone who has stood at the edge of something very large and come back and is therefore slightly less afraid of ordinary difficulty than most people are. People sensed this in her without being able to name it. They came to her kitchen table with their problems, which were real problems. Money and illness and marriages and the cold and she listened to each one with the complete attention I had watched her give to Grand for 22 years. And she offered what practical help was in her capacity to offer, and she did not sentimentalize and she did not judge, and people left her kitchen feeling that their problem had been accurately witnessed, which is often the thing a person needs more than they need a solution. She never explained what she had done, and she never repented of it, and she never, to my knowledge, told anyone who had not already figured out for themselves. Sylvie knew, of course, Sylvie had grown up alongside Grand and had her own memories and her own private account of those years, and mother and daughter had an understanding about those memories that was, as far as I could see, one of the primary structures of their closeness. Madeleine died in the first week of March 2023, which was the coldest March in a long while. She died in her own house, in her own bed, with Sylvie beside her, and she died the way she had lived, with her hands flat and her attention complete, and no more fuss than was necessary. She was 95 years old. She had kept the storage room door closed and the latch unchanged for 40 years, not as a shrine and not as a memorial, but simply because there was no reason to change it, and because the door closed properly and the latch worked, and she was not a woman who altered things that functioned. Sylvie found the food at the tree line the morning after the funeral, a quantity of food that had been left there at some point in the night, carefully arranged on the flat stones Madeleine had used for that purpose for 30 years, since the time she had first begun leaving food there herself. Sylvie did not know that her mother had stopped leaving food at the tree line in 1983, when Grand had gone back to the river country, and that she had never resumed it. Sylvie did not know what to make of what she found on those stones, and she came to my house and told me about it, and I listened, and I did not say what I thought. I am saying it now. I do not know what was on those stones. No one knows. I know what Madeleine would have said, which is that the world is more full than we understand, and that the fullness of it is not a problem to be solved. She would have said it simply in that particular register of hers that was formal and warm at once. And she would have said it without any need for me to agree or disagree, because she had stopped needing agreement a long time ago. The morning I drove her back from the logging road, the morning of the last day of August 1983, she asked me a question I have kept for more than 40 years. Kept it the way you keep a thing that has no other home. She asked whether I thought she had done right by him. She asked quietly, looking at the window, not at me, in the way of questions that are not requests for an answer, but are requests for a witness. I said yes. I said it because I believed it, and because I believe it still, and because the proper answer to a question like that, asked by a woman like that, in a life like hers, is not elaborated and is not hedged. You say yes. You say it plainly, and you mean it the way she would have meant it, which is completely without excess and with the full weight of everything you know. Clue is gone. Madeleine is gone. The storage room door is still closed in a house in Corbeil Forks that Sylvie will sell in the spring. The logging roads have grown back toward the Nashkuri River country in the way that logging roads always do when the timber companies move on, and the bush has taken back whatever the roads cleared, and the river is still there, cold and steady, moving south in the way that rivers move when nothing is watching them, and when everything is. I do not know what is in those woods. I have never known. I know what I saw over 22 years in the house at the end of Madeleine Auger's road. And what I saw was a woman who understood something about love that most of us spend our lives approaching without arriving at, which is that love does not require permanence to be complete. It is complete in the doing of it, doing in the steadiness of it, in the willingness to let the thing you love move toward what calls it, even when what calls it is beyond the trees and beyond your reaching, and to stand at the edge of the road and watch it go, and to turn around afterward and get back in the truck. That is all I have to say. I think it is enough.